And it was such an illustration, I think, for me, just of life, like what you do when those holes happen and there's this ugly place and we tried to patch it over and it didn't work. You try to pretend it's not there, but like, you can't ignore it. And the answer in that case was to give it purpose. And so it made me think about my own life and what I'd seen. And so that was how the idea, I think, for the book originally started. And so when I was looking for a title, I was actually wanting to incorporate the idea of the tree and that kind of life. And my mom and I were actually just sitting in our kitchen looking through the Bible, looking at verses that talked about trees. And this verse in Job came up where it just said at the very scent of water. It says, this verse in Job came up that basically says, even if a tree dies and its roots decay at the very scent of water, it will come back to life. And I felt like that was perfect. That was exactly what I wanted. I loved that it wasn't just even at water, but at the very scent of water. And
as you mentioned that, as I started reading the book, I got the impression it was a book about suffering. But the further I got into it, I saw that it was finding worth and beauty in things that are damaged and flawed. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's good to know, because I think that's very accurate. I think for me, when I first started doing the work of Wellspring, part of what I was drawn to was just hearing about these great injustices that were happening around the world and just feeling this human responsibility to participate. But I think there was another side to it personally, where it was almost a little bit of running, I think, from my own life and the things that I wasn't able to fix and wanting to almost get lost in someone else's life and try to do for them what I couldn't do for myself. And I think that was part of the motivation in the first place. But what I found in those places were kinds of beauty I'd never witnessed before in the most tragically flawed places and circumstances. And it was powerful, and it changed me. And I think what I learned from that, just wanting to be able to pass that on, both to kind of encourage people to be willing to look in those flawed places that aren't so obvious and actually aren't easy to look at. But I think you see the most magnificent kinds of restoration and redemption and what real beauty is, the kind that can't be airbrushed away.
You start the book talking about you'd gone through a difficult time, and so you decide to remedy that by traveling to a lot of different places. And somebody once told me that the way to get through personal suffering is to serve others, and it appears that's exactly what you've done.
Yeah, I think so. I think even though it felt, I think, almost a little bit like running, it really wasn't running because I wanted to see other people in pain or anything like that. It was almost just the only thing I knew to do. It almost felt almost a little therapeutic of getting outside of my own life and my own world. And I think for all of us, I think that's important to do, whatever your circumstances, but realizing there's a world like much bigger than you. And I think it helps to almost get lost in that and realize that you're part of this much larger picture and larger story. And it did do its own form of healing. I wouldn't say I set out to do it for that reason. It was just the only thing I knew how to do with this like angst and frustration was how can I try to participate in someone else's life? But it ended up actually healing a part of my own. And I think at least starting me on a journey of learning to accept my life and to recognize beauty in other people's lives and in my life in places where I didn't expect to find it.
And you tell the stories of what you're finding as you were on those trips, traveling for Wellspring. For those that are watching or listening and aren't familiar with it, tell us about Wellspring and what you do.
We started Wellspring International as a part of RZIM in 2004, and RZIM had always contributed to, we called it the Benevolence Fund, which was giving out to people in need around the world as we saw it. But when we started Wellspring, it was giving it a more prominent place, a more specific place in part of the ministry, and also allowing other people to participate in it. And what we really wanted to do is bridge people who want to give to these kinds of causes, women who've been victims of prostitution or domestic violence, people around the world who are suffering with HIV, children who've been orphaned and abandoned, and just this vast array of needs. And we weren't picking one need that was ours, that we were called to, and wanting to bring everyone else on board. The idea was actually just really wanting to be that bridge that helped people to know where to go, so that whatever God called them to, the need that they were drawn to, they could go to a place that would help them find those organizations that were acting with integrity and working to meet those legitimate needs and doing it well. I think over the last couple of years, there's just been a growing disillusionment with nonprofits, and people aren't always exactly sure where their money goes and if it goes to the people that need it. And we wanted to help fill that gap and provide confidence that we would do the due diligence for them. We would do the site visits and evaluate these organizations and then facilitate the process. 100% of people's gifts that are given to RZIM and designated for Wellspring go directly to the project, and we monitor the use of funds and report back to them on exactly how it was used.
Well, let's talk about some of those people that you met on these world travels that you took while doing this work for Wellspring. First of all, Annie from Amsterdam. Tell us her story.
I met Annie the first time I went to Amsterdam, actually, and I was really nervous on that first trip when I went. And it was a scene like I haven't seen anything like it still. And every time I go to Amsterdam, it's still one of the most difficult trips for me. It takes days, it seems, before I feel like I can put together a coherent sentence. But it's different. You know, if you go to the red light districts in India and all throughout Asia, there's a darkness to them. They're kind of seedy. The women are behind bars, which is horrific. But there is this sense of something that should be hidden. But you go to Amsterdam, and it's all lights, and it's glamour, and it's just so out there in front of you. And you have 400 women, each behind a window, and they were organized by nationality, like it was a shopping store or something. And it was just so upsetting and just so horrific. There's no other scene like it in the world. I just don't think you could do that with any other area of the world and put a human being up for sale, and that hundreds and thousands of people would gather to look or participate. So it's a harsh scene, and it's hard to see, and so you're taking in kind of all of these sites. And Annie was she's someone that has always stayed with me, both her story and the words that she said. But the way we met her was a little bit humorous. We had just completed doing an interview with the organization we work with there called Scarlet Cord. And so our cameraman, Bob, was leaving the red light district and had his camera over his shoulder. And we actually had purposely not walked with him just because I didn't want to draw any attention, especially since I was with my friend there from Scarlet Cord, and he was walking separately from us to leave. But this girl came out of her window, and she said, "Did you see that guy?" And we said, "What?" She said, "Some guy is walking around here with a camera." And we were like, "Really?" I was like, "Oh, no." And she was like, "Well, I showed him. I took my whole can of Sprite and poured it over his head." And I was like, "Good for you." Great. And so, but she invited us in to talk, and she ended up sharing her story with us, and she had a really sad story of how she'd ended up behind the window. And I make a long story short here. The full story is in the book. But she had actually been put behind the window by her husband. She was from Singapore, did not speak Dutch, and had married this guy, and he brought her to Amsterdam and took her passport. She couldn't communicate. She couldn't leave the country. She was afraid to go to the police, and put her behind a window to work. And she'd been there for several years. I thought she was maybe about 40, and when she said her age, she said she was 26. And I think just those years of just hardship just showed on her face, and she went back and forth. Like sometimes she was this very vulnerable, fragile person, and then the next second it was this angry, fierce, like kind of frightening person. And you just saw how she was struggling to deal with like the pain herself, and it would come out in different ways. But we talked to her for a little while, and after she shared her story, the way part of it ended was she finally was able to recover her passport, and she went back home. But her family disowned her when they found out what had happened, and she wasn't expecting that. And she was just so relieved to be home. And when that happened, she looked at us and she said, "So I came back here because this is what I am." And she said, "What happened to me, my family disowning me, that was the most painful thing that's ever happened." So she said, "I'll stay here because this is where I belong now."
How many of those women do you suppose are there in that type of circumstance? They're forced to be there, not because they want to be.
It's an interesting, you get two types of statistics. People will talk about the women who are trafficked and the women who are there by choice. The ones who are trafficked were actually bought and sold, that kind of thing. But the ones who are there by choice, Annie would fit the category of a woman who is there by choice. But when you hear her story, there wasn't really any kind of choice at all.
Tell us about Nolene, who you met in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us her story.
I met Nolene the first year we started Wellspring, and it was at a home for women who had been in prostitution, and it was a rehabilitation home for prostitution and drug addiction. And she had been in the home 8 times before. This was her 9th time. She would come in and complete the program, but sometimes what can be difficult for women in these circumstances is they complete a rehabilitation program, and then you graduate, and then you're free to go, but they have nothing to go to. They don't have a job. They don't have an education to fall back on. They don't know how to provide for themselves. And so they end up going back to what they know. And that's what had happened to her. And so when I was there, I asked her if there was anything in the world she could do, what would it be? And instantly she said, I want to be a chef. I've always wanted to be a chef. And just struck me as, I mean, it wasn't like she was like, I want to go be a model in Hollywood, or, those are hard dreams to make happen. It was just such this reasonable, good dream. And so we came back and tried to see what we could do and made contact with a culinary school in South Africa and had an agreement with them that she would have to apply. She had to get herself in. She had to meet all the deadlines. We weren't going to help in that area. But if she did get accepted, we would provide the funds for her to go to culinary school. And she did get accepted, and so we gave the grant, and she ended up graduating at the very top of her class and got a job at a 4-star hotel in Cape Town.
Oh, you must love these stories when you hear the aftermath of what's happened.
It's good. It's, it's an interesting world. Like, you see such extremes, and I think that's a little bit hard. You're seeing such darkness, and not all stories end that way. Not all stories end like Nolene, and not all of them will. But I think you get those glimpses of the ones that do, and that makes everything worthwhile. And others are a much longer road. I think with these kinds of heartaches and tragedies, there is no easy fix. And you hang in there for all of them.
You do what you can.
Yeah.
You spent a lot of time in India. And I thought it was interesting. You wrote in the book that India is a place that around every corner something will break your heart. Mm-hmm. And I thought it interesting that in a way to cure a broken heart, you would go to a place that would break it even more. Why did you do that?
That's actually an interesting question. I think maybe it's because I think when your heart does get broken, there aren't any easy answers anymore. And I think the only way to find restoration and healing is to really immerse yourself in the things that are real and the things that are meaningful and the things that are true in life. And in, I think, a very divine form of irony, it seems that there is when you find like the hope and healing. Again, it doesn't work to go to the places that are neatly packaged and everything's perfect. I think it's almost frustrating because like that's not the way it happened for you, or that's not what's real. There's nothing to hang on to in those kinds of things. But when you go into the depths of, I think, struggle and where there's been a fight and you see that someone's had to fight to survive and what comes through the end of that, I think that's something that you are able to hang on to, and you feel like that's what life and meaning end up being about.
You realize how opposite this sounds to the way most people think. They would think I go through a hard time, I'll go check into a 5-star hotel, and that's not the way to do it, though.
No, I think there's some of that in all of us, I think, because it seems like the obvious answer, but I think it only almost increases a restlessness inside all of us. And it's not that those places are bad. I think they have different things to offer. I don't think they have healing to offer. I think it is in really throwing yourselves into the depths of suffering where I think you can only then can you really start to understand it or start to come through it or realize what can be gained from it. One of my friends said to me she was struggling with something, and she's been through a lot of challenges in her life, but she said, the easy answers or even people who haven't had any kind of struggle, they don't have anything they can give me. They don't have anything they can seem to offer me to help me through this. And I think those are the things that are attractive because they seem simple, but they are in a way empty as far as being able to offer answers or comfort for, I think, the great realities of life.
While in India, one of the groups you worked with was a group known as Burned Brides. Tell us what that is. Yeah,
an organization called Agni Raksha, and they actually treat several kinds of burn victims. It's estimated in India that there are about 20,000 women that are victims of bride burning every year. That's guessed to be a very, very low estimate because most go unreported, or if they are reported, they're blamed on household accidents rather than a crime. So it's a very difficult thing to measure. But this is related to the dowry system in India, and what will often happen is that after the woman is married, the family or her husband will ask for more dowry from her family than was given, than was agreed upon before, or they want the rest of what had been agreed upon before. And if her family cannot or does not provide it, then the punishment will be that the bride is set on fire, and that usually happens either by her husband or her mother-in-law. And they will douse her with kerosene and light her on fire. And very often the kids are around as well, too, and they'll run to help their mother and be burned as well. And so this organization is treating women who are victims of this kind of horrific crime.
Many of the women you talked about were victimized by men, treated very poorly by men, and I imagine as a result they hate men. You have your own scars as the result of what men have done to you. How do you keep from feeling the same way?
I don't know that that's entirely true. It's not easy. I think, I guess I would answer that in two ways, from them or from me. When I first started, I actually remember calling my dad. I was in Amsterdam in the red light district, and I called him on my cell phone, and I said, I'm really afraid. I'm afraid with all that I'm seeing and hearing, that combined with my own experience, that I'll never be able to trust men again. And there was that fear and kind of awareness inside. I think it is actually an incredible opportunity for men. It's a type of ministry that I'd really like to see men more engaged in. And I think some of them, there are many men who would love to do this, and I'm not sure how. They can't go into a red light district and that kind of thing and do those forms of outreach and ministry. But I think they have a very powerful role, because I think just because they are a man, they're able to accomplish a healing in a woman who's been victimized or hurt by a man that a woman can't do. One of the organizations we work with is in Bombay. It's called Bombay Teen Challenge, and it's run by a man. His name is Dave Raj, and he has been working with women who've been victims of prostitution, and pretty much all the women there have been trafficked. He told me that it took 2 years of going out on the street every day and talking to these women before the first one would even answer him back. And I thought that was an incredible picture of perseverance. But their faces just beam when they see him. And I think not only has he been able to help them out of their situations, but he's restored a faith in them too, in believing that there are good men, and there are men who can be trusted, who will not hurt them. And I think that's an incredible opportunity that men have to help restore some of that in women who have seen something very different.
You wrote eloquently about how you've been judged and hurt by others as you've gone through difficult times. How do you keep from judging them for the things they've done to you?
That's probably, in all honesty, a very big challenge. And I think it's something that I still continue to work through. It's one of those things that I don't think you reach a day where all of a sudden you've achieved it and then you're good. I have to continue to work at that because it will be something that continues to come up. And each time I do feel that judgment or that hurt, it's deeply painful, and it resurrects old wounds that I've worked really hard to move past. And I think that's the most difficult part. There is a part in me where I feel upset, and I feel, I guess, a sense of injustice. But I think more than anything, it's not anger that it does. It's just actually just deep hurt, because, my life has not gone exactly the way I would have dreamed, the way I would have wanted. And I would honestly still give anything to change some of those details. And I have to work every day at still accepting the things that happened that I wish weren't there. I can recognize where I've come and what they taught me and what they gave me. And that's been significant for me. But it doesn't mean you look back and you're glad they happened. Mm-hmm. And so when people do that, it stirs those places, those deep hurts that it takes so much time and so many steps to begin to move forward and walk away from. And so I do have to work at it, as much as I am asking for grace from them. I have to work in my own way when I don't find it in them, to being able to extend it myself in a very different way. But I think it's an ongoing process.
All Christians hope that when they go through difficult times, and very difficult times, that the church would be there to help them. How do you think the church has done in the area of divorce with those who have been through that?
I don't think the church has done very well at all. And I think that there's a lot of very deeply hurting and wounded people. I can say, even from my own experience, it's been somewhat alienating, and it's been hard to find my place in the church again. I think for me, I didn't have a struggle with God personally. Even though there were moments where I didn't understand what was happening or why he would allow certain things to happen, I did always feel a confidence that he still was who he said he was. And my relationship with him feels very secure and confident that way. It's been much more difficult with the church, I think, because they use his name, but some of the things they do are not always reflective of the person of Christ or the grace that is so, I think, such a foundation of our faith. And what it has felt like is that we put limits on God's grace, that it's great enough to cover everyone else's flaws and sins, but it felt like but it wasn't enough to cover mine. and that was really difficult. And I wanted to be a part of the church, but I felt like the church told me I didn't quite fit anymore. And so I think we have some ground to recover that way. It's been interesting to get some responses to the book. There have been several heartbroken responses of people who have been in that situation and they left the church and never went back, or someone who wrote and said her brother has never fully recovered. And she said, I don't even think it was exactly when I look in his eyes and they're so empty right now and broken, it's not even actually what happened in the divorce, but it was the response of the church afterwards that's left him just unsure how to move forward. And so I think just as Christ did for all of us, I think the church is still learning how to handle those issues. They're complicated, and I recognize that. But remembering that you're dealing with a person, I think if we could always keep that at the forefront of our minds, it is a person and it's raw wounds, and be careful how you step on those sometimes and how you reach out to someone. I think the message of grace is far more powerful than the message of wanting to or making someone feel condemned to a label that they'll never be able to erase.
Toward the end of the book, you write, and let me read from it, you said it's the responsibility of each woman to find her particular calling, finding her place in God's plan. Do you think you found your place in God's plan?
My place in God's plan? I think I learned that I had a particular place in God's plan. And I think that was significant for me. I think especially in Christian circles, we talk a lot about the adventure of life and going on an adventure and going on someone else's adventure and being a part of theirs and that kind of thing. And I think that there are definite values to looking at your place in life that way. But I think in the midst of when we talk about that, whether it's in partnership with someone else or on your own, I would think what we don't want to lose is that every person has a singular calling. I think in the book I mentioned, I think God's calling for us is no one actually plays second fiddle to another. So when we talk about someone's adventure, and specifically we'll say a woman accompanying a man on his adventure, there is something in that of doing that together. But let's not lose sight of the fact that I think God has that calling for each individual, and that's not lost because you're doing it with someone else. It's powerful. It's just as prevalent in the life of someone who is on that road and adventure on their own as someone else who joins another. And I think that was significant for me, I think, as a woman, to feel like God saw me and that he had a specific purpose for me. Figuring that out, I think, is something I'll always be learning to do. And it's not a formula, and I don't think he hands it to me on any one day. It's living life, but that's enough to actually recognize he has a plan for me, and there's a calling that was specifically intended for me.
The book is out now. Mm-hmm. And it's called The Scent of Water. Thanks for writing it. I'm sure people will be blessed by what they read in it.
Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.